Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Shormila Mojumdar, Associate Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. This is your module on the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is an American poet who lived in the 19th century. She was born in 1830. And she is probably one singular example of a poet who hardly published in her lifetime. She wrote around 1500 poems, but barely any of these was ever published during her lifetime. And so, when we talk about Emily Dickinson and the secondary material, you will find that there is absolutely no mention of her in contemporary literary magazines, studies, and nobody interviewed her, so she never talked about her idea of poetry and all these kinds of things that is normally available about other poets. So this is something very interesting. And why did she become a kind of recluse? That has been a matter of considerable speculation in the literary circle, and it is one of those very exciting stories of literary detection. And there are various theories about why she did that, but the fact remains that she went to a residential school in Mount Holyoke and came back home and spent the rest of her life there, barely going out of her home. She was a very caring family member, looked after both her parents, her brother who lived next door, his children, and her sister. So probably throughout the day she cooked, cleaned, washed, and did all kinds of household chores. Hardly anybody knew that she wrote poetry. Her younger sister Lavinia did, and it was Lavinia who was instrumental in publishing posthumously her poems. Now, when we come to the poetry of Emily Dickinson, we have to remember certain facts of her life. One is that she was born in a very conservative puritanical family in New York, in the town of Amherst. Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 in Amherst, Massachusetts. She was born to Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross Dickinson. In her family, she has her elder brother, Austin, and her youngest sister, Lavinia. She is considered one of the most eminent poets in the history of American literary tradition. Dickinson has written more than thousands of poems, but she never thought of making them published. She has ordered to burn all her scraps and letters. Now, when you come to that, one thing is astonishing, because she has ordered all her poems chronologically, arranged them neatly, and is there any reason to believe that she didn't want them to be published at all? Because if she didn't, she would never have arranged them chronologically the way she did. But the fact remains that she never published these poems during her lifetime, and it was her sister who took up the arduous task of collecting all these, arranging all these, and publishing the first volume of her poetry, and subsequently other volumes were also added to the first volume, because they discovered more poems and then more poems, and they were added to these editions. In her early days, she enjoyed both her social and family life, but by the time she reached in her 30s, she made an withdrawal from the outer world. The reason of her withdrawal have been explained by many biographers in many ways. The most prominent reason was that this seclusion was her chosen one. So that is what we have been talking about. Nobody knows for sure why did she withdraw from public life, but she did, and she was largely a self-taught woman. She read reasonably widely, and when she wrote these poems, as will be evident from the texts, some of which we may discuss in the later part of this talk, that she had imbibed certain influences of canonical English literature, and she was striking a new path for herself, which is evident in the poems, not only in the themes of the poems but also in the structure and the stylistics of the poems as well. The element that makes Dickinson's poetry unique is her very skillful use of imagery. The most prominent within which are the imagery of death, nature, immortality, desire, hope and despair. In Dickinson's poetic oeuvre, there are a large number of poems about death. One very well-known poem is "Because I Could Not Stop for Death," and the second line comes, "Because I could not stop for death, he has kindly stopped for me." Now you can see here very well that she is talking of death in terms of a beloved, a suitor, who probably finally becomes the husband, because the poet narrates how a very civil man, probably quoting the poetic persona, comes to visit her, takes her into his carriage, drives her through the school, past the horizon, and finally they reach a house which looks like a grave, and there is a sepulchre, and then she says that now that I look back, I feel as if I'm riding towards eternity, and though I have been living here for a long time, it seems only the other day that I was there. So you see, the transition from life to death is so smooth that there is something horrible associated with death in our imagination, that death is loss of life, which means complete annihilation of existence, that death can be painful, that death is separation from our beloved ones, death is horrible, death is dark, death is frightening. But in Dickinson's poetry, you will find that she is not talking about death in any of these terms but in which death has so far been described, dealt with or explored. So in this poem, death is only a suitor, he is a lover, he is a man who takes her in his carriage and probably drives her to her permanent residence. So you can see the metaphor here, a young girl getting married, and she describes how she is dressed in her finery, just like a bride, and she goes with him, with her husband, to her new marital home. So passage from this life to the next life, which is the life after death, is like a young girl moving from her parental home to her marital home. There are several other poems in which she talks about death, and the kind of imagery she uses, they are, in a word, extraordinary, because these images are not typically literary images and not necessarily drawn from the usual sources from which literary imagery is drawn. So when she describes death, for example, in a poem, the first line of which reads, "A clock stopped." So the poem is called "A Clock Stopped." So what happens when a clock stops? It is a metaphor for the stopping of the human heart. And one thing I must make clear to you, that in Dickinson's poem, most of the time images become metaphors and metaphors became images. Normally this is something you don't find in many cases, where metaphors are metaphors and images are images. But what happens in Dickinson's poem, that metaphors become images and images become metaphor. So she is comparing the human heart to a clock. So like the clock, the human heart ticks, and time is measured by clock and the ticking of human heart measures the lifespan of an individual. So you can see how apt the metaphor is, and then she continues with the imagery of a clock. So there is the clock which ticks, makes a tick tock sound, and which indicates that the heart is pumping, and so the person is alive. And so when the clock stops, it is the heart that stops working, and so it is synonymous with death. That is what is meant by death, that your heart stops. And what else happens after the heart stops? And the way she talks about death, you see that it is never a blow from somewhere else, that there is a severance of tie between this life and the next life. It is always a safe passage, very comfortable and smooth passage from this life to that next life. And so what happens? As you die, your heart stops. It is like just like that the clock stops. And here is something else which I would like you to remember, that clock measures time, and human life is measured by the ticking of the clock of a human heart. So we can go to another poem which will make it clear to you how she deals with the theme of death, and how she uses various kinds of metaphors and imagery to make it clear that death is nothing violent, death is not oppressive, death is not frightful, and in none of these poems she takes up the conventional format of death poetry, which is elegy. She is not writing an elegy. And another thing which is important, that she is not even philosophizing in the Christian tenor, because what theology, Christian theology, and there are several other systems of theology which teaches people that death, this life is temporary, and as you die, you actually enter your permanent life, something like Tennyson's poem Crossing the Bar, and as you cross the bar you meet your creator face to face, and your eternal life begins. So there is nothing in death to be mourned, death is actually to be celebrated. But Dickinson is not really following any of the cues provided by Christian theology. She is not saying that it is eternal life that she is entering, that she is happy to meet her creator face to face, but at the same time she is not suggesting that death is being mourned. She is not suggesting that just as it happens in an elegy, that the dead person is not really dead, he is there, he is at one mingled with the nature, exactly the way it happens in Milton's Lycidas, for example, or Shelley's Adonis, for example. So you see, she treats death in a unique way, something which is exclusively hers, and the way she uses metaphors and poetry, that is also exclusively hers. Dickinson's conventional nature poems celebrates nature as gentlest mother. She could feel the presence of the divine power in the elements of nature. Dickinson skillfully portrayed sensuous surface imagery by contrasting the world of man with that of nature. So Dickinson, though she is a contemporary of the transcendentalists, the poets, at least Hawthorne was a transcendentalist for some time. He shared the same community living with Emerson and Thoreau. Probably because she didn't have any social contact, she didn't have any contact with her contemporary literary figures. So the transcendentalist influence is not very evident on her poetry the way it is evident on one of her contemporaries, Walt Whitman. So she lived in a world of her own, and the poetic conventions and the poetic strategies that she used were mostly her own. The philosophical idea of transcendence believes in oneness with God, man and nature. Transcendence means beyond and above. Dickinson's poetry reverberates the idea of oneness of the individual soul with that of the universal. Yes, she did believe in soul, because there is another poem again about love, the first line of which is the soul selects her own society. So you see, she looks at death as being liberation from physicality, but the soul lives on, and when the body is dead, the soul is liberated from the body, the soul selects her own society, and then what happens? She shuts the door. And the image that she uses there in this poem, it is like somebody shutting the door. That is, death is shutting the door to physical life, and then there is the master with whom the soul, lives in the chosen, because the master is the chosen company, the soul who has selected her own company and own society, and prefers to live with that company. One thing I want to emphasize here is that she is not mourning at all. She is talking in a tone which is rather matter of fact, as if death is a reality of life. And so what happens when somebody does? The physical description is also there in many of her poems. What happens? The heart stops. And what happens when the heart stops? It's almost, she almost uses physiological chain of events that follow the stopping of a heart, of a human heart, that the blood supply to brain stops, as a result of which the person doesn't think, doesn't feel, doesn't see, doesn't hear, and finally there is a breach in the plank and she falls down and down and down. Probably that's the kind of feeling a dying person has when the dying person loses contact with the outside world of the five senses. Dickinson in her poetry also made this presence clear when in one of her poetry she refers to the all-encompassing entity as Papa above. So you can see the influence of puritanical teaching on her, because she was brought up in a puritanical family, and the hegemony of the Christian God is there to be found in her poetry. There is a continuous battle in the mind of Dickinson between her undying faith in the Supreme Creator and her intuition for this inevitable truth of life. Dickinson never made any avoidance to death, rather she wages questions to explore the identity of death. Death is personalized in her poetry, sometimes as a tyrant and sometimes as a kind companion. She considered death as a loss of physical entity, not as a spiritual one. Now you see, Dickinson was not overtly religious like her puritanical forefathers, but she definitely was spiritual, because by spiritual I mean something which is opposed to materiality. So she believed in the spirit, she believed in the soul, but not necessarily a Christian one. Before we go to read one of her death poems in detail, I would like to draw your attention to several things in her poetry. The first thing is, none of these poems has a title. She just wrote them down and she never gave them any title. When the poems were published posthumously, most of the editors, they chose to use the first line of the poem as the title of the poem. This is something which has happened consistently to all her poems, and in any good edition of Emily Dickinson's poems, you will find that there is the first line which is used as a title and a number which kind of denotes the poem. That's one thing. And secondly, which is equally interesting, is that she doesn't use grammatical punctuation, because you know in English grammar you are supposed to use comma when you mean a short pause, a semicolon, slightly longer, and when you finally come to a stop you use a full stop, and there are several other punctuation marks which kind of thematically defines the poem, because you don't really use a comma when you mean a full stop, because a full stop is primarily thematical. How do you indicate the thematic stop? You use a full stop. A comma is used when thematically you mean a short pause. But interestingly, Emily Dickinson never used any of these conventional English grammatically sanctioned punctuation marks. The only punctuation mark she has ever used is dash. So a dash replaces a comma, a semicolon, even sometimes a full stop. So most of the editors, they have retained the original punctuation. And why did she do that? That's an interesting question, because I think she was a kind of a rebel who was defying all kinds of conventions in writing poetry, and that is why she did not conform to the standard punctuation marks, and she devised her own ways and means of indicating how her poems should be read out if necessary, and should be read so far as its meanings is concerned. Now here is a poem which is called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Another thing which I should also have talked about is her use of capitals. And you know, English grammar has certain rules for using capitals. For example, when you are beginning a sentence, the first letter should be in capital. When you are using proper names, the first letter should be in capital. So rather arbitrary use of capitals is another stylistic feature of Emily Dickinson's poetry. But if you read the poems carefully, you will find that the words in which she has used the capitals in the middle of a sentence, the word is a common noun, it's not a proper name or something, probably she wants to emphasize it. So her way of emphasizing a word is to use a capital letter. A word which carries an idea which she wants to emphasize, she uses a capital letter. So now just read the first line of this particular poem. I felt a funeral in my brain, and the B is in capital. So what is a funeral? A funeral takes place after death. So the funeral is ritualistic. So if you are dead, if I am dead, the poetic persona is dead, how can the poetic persona feel a funeral? And that is too in her or his brain. Now when the heart stops pumping, what happens? The blood supply to the brain stops, and as soon as the blood supply to the brain stops, the person stops feeling, stops thinking, and that is how a person dies. So the moment of death is like feeling a funeral, a service which takes place after death, and he feels it in her brain. So what she is highlighting is something very scientific, physiological, almost pertaining to medical science, that the blood supply to the brain has stopped, and that is how she feels the funeral in her brain. and she can feel the mourners, and the M is in capital again. So she is dead, but still she feels that there are mourners who are going to and fro, and they are treading rather softly because here is a dead body lying in wake, and so people are very polite, people are very gentle, people are treading softly. And how long can she feel that? Till that sense was breaking through, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. So she is simultaneously describing the experience of a dying person and a dead person. There is a huge hiatus, there normally is a huge hiatus between the two, but in her poetry what happens that as if this is there is a passage between this life and death, and the dying person moves between these two worlds. We come to the second stanza. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, beating till I thought my mind was going numb. So the word which has been used in capital is drum. So how does a dying person feel? That there is a thumping sound in her brain. So it's a thumping sound, beating, and beating has been repeated. There is beating, and then my mind is completely devoid of thoughts, and my mind has gone numb. So that is what happens after death. The dead person can't think, and so doesn't have a mind, and even if he has, as she imagines that the dead person has a mind, but it has gone completely numb. So you see how he deals with the experience of death. Nobody is crying, nobody is very disturbed that I am dying. It's so painful, and what is going to happen to me after I die? It's all darkness beyond death. So I am being separated from my near and dear ones on this earth. Nothing like that. She is describing a physical, almost the physical experience of dying, that it is first in the brain, then the brain stops working, and so no thought, and the mind goes dumb. So we come to the third stanza. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll. So there is a Christian reference, of course, the bell. It so happens when a parishioner dies, the parish church starts ringing a bell so that everybody knows that somebody has died in the parish. So she has died, so there is a bell. You remember those lines, for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee and me. And then she, and in this particular stanza also, she is talking about a box with a capital B, which is actually a coffin, because that is the natural sequence of actions, isn't it? Somebody has died and a coffin has been ordered, and the coffin is a box, basically a much bigger box. So the box has been ordered, and when the dead body is put inside the coffin, what happens? It is sealed with lead. So as if there is a creaking across her soul. So the body is put into the coffin, and it is sealed, and the soul has been liberated from the body, and the bell starts tolling, announcing a death in the parish. We come to the next stanza. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence some strange race wrecked solitary here. And this is a text, you see here the editor has put appropriate punctuation marks, but in the original writing all these punctuation marks were not there, no comma or nothing like this. Well, coming back to the text, so the bell rings, and the poetic persona has just become an ear. she doesn't have any other bodily function, she can only hear, and she can hear the bell tolling, and as if the entire heaven has been turned into a huge bell, and it tolls, and everybody has come to know about her death, and it tolls so loudly that she, being a dead person, seemed to have an ear and seemed to listen to the tolling of the bell. And then the last stanza, and then what happens? A plank in the reason broke. A plank, you know, is a plank, and the P is in capital. What happens when there is the plank in reason broke? Actually, she loses her rationality, because a dead person is not supposed to have any rationality, and he falls down, and she falls down and down until she hit world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. So she goes beyond all kinds of sensory perception. So from this poem, probably it is clear how Emily Dickinson dealt with the theme of death rather unconventionally. So you see, I have tried to read a poem by Emily Dickinson, a very well known one, and about the most important theme in her poetry, death, and I have tried to show you how she has used the theme of death in her poetry, and how she has gone beyond the puritanical tradition which she inherited, how she has tried to break new paths for herself, and probably that supports my argument that she was a very consummate and conscious poet who wrote the poems consciously, being very critical about what she was doing, and arranged them chronologically, arranged them neatly in her drawer, and left them as manuscripts for the posterity to discover herself, because as she herself said, I am nobody, who are you? And it's tiring like a frog talking to the bog all through summer. So she preferred to be exclusive, reclusive, and very, very special. Thank you.